From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. First, the headlines. Indefensible. U.S. billionaires became $2.1 trillion richer during the pandemic. Amnesty International asks Sri Lanka to end violence discrimination against Muslims. India Foreign Minister hails Israel as most trusted partner during Israel visit. Khalilzad steps down as top U.S. envoy to Afghanistan. And a special segment on the history of Paris massacre of 1961. Our top story tonight. New research shows 745 people worldwide amassed a combined wealth of $5 trillion during the COVID-19 pandemic, most of which will never be taxed. According to a new analysis unveiled Monday, American billionaires grew in number and expanded their fortunes by $2.1 trillion since the pandemic began. The report by Americans for Tax Fairness and the Institute for Policy Studies found this collective wealth is two-thirds more than the $3 trillion held by the bottom 50% of U.S. households. Sri Lanka's Muslim community has suffered discrimination, harassment, and violence since 2013, according to a new report by Amnesty International. This has led to government policies explicitly targeting the minority group. The report traces the development of anti-Muslim sentiment in Sri Lanka amid rising Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. Anti-Muslim discrimination has evolved from a series of mob attacks to increasingly hostile government policies. That includes forced cremation of Muslims who have died from COVID-19 and proposals to ban niqab and madrasas. Amnesty International's Deputy Secretary General Kyle Ward said the situation has regressed sharply in recent years. India's top diplomat called Israel a most trusted partner at a meeting with U.S., Indian, and Israeli business leaders and government officials on Sunday. Indian Foreign Minister Subrahmanyam Jaishankar encouraged increasing trade ties between the countries during the meeting at Jerusalem's King David Hotel. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi's right-wing government, India has struck a special bond with Israel. Both countries have moved further toward the right in the past few years. Their positions on domestic and international issues are also at odds with international law. In 2019, India's then Consul General in New York, Sandeep Chakravorty, called Israel's settlements on Palestinian land an inspiration for the Modi government's plans for Kashmir. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made a visit Monday to the Indigenous community of Kamloops. That is where the remains of 215 children were found in May at a former residential school. The Catholic boarding schools were set up a century ago to forcibly assimilate Indigenous peoples. Nearly 6 months after the discovery, the Indigenous community of Kamloops is struggling to heal as it continues to search for other remains and tries to identify them.
No child should ever have been taken from their home and forced into the residential school system. No child should ever have been taught that their language, that their culture, that their identity has no value. It is unacceptable that this was done to your children.
Indigenous communities have testified for years about thousands of children who disappeared from boarding schools. In recent months, more than 1,000 anonymous graves have been found near the schools. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded in 2015 the forced assimilation of First Nations people amounted to cultural genocide. Here, a survivor of an Indigenous boarding school hopes for unmarked graves to be identified.
I think it's very important to find their identity, like I said, so they could finish their journey home. They've been waiting there for a long time. And now that they've been discovered, they have to find at first who they are, who they were.
The head of Lebanon's Hezbollah said Monday the Iran-backed movement had 100,000 trained and armed fighters at its disposal. Hassan Nasrallah was speaking in response to deadly violence in Beirut last week. He accused the Christian party Lebanese forces of being behind the killing. 7 members of his movement and a Shia ally, Amal, were killed at a rally Thursday. Nasrallah warned the group against sparking a civil war. To the sound of drum beats, religious chants resounded Sunday evening for the first ceremony of its kind at Iraq's historic Al-Nouri Mosque. It was to celebrate Prophet Muhammad's birthday on Monday. God's peace and blessings be upon him. The city of Mosul's 12th century mosque is known for its leaning minaret. It was severely damaged in the 2017 civil war. It is being rebuilt under a project from the United Nations Cultural Agency. Here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopian children arrive at Anwar Mosque with their families to celebrate. Syrians gathered in the old city of Damascus on the eve of celebrations marking the Prophet's birth, known in Arabic as the Mawlid al-Nabawi holiday. In Yemen, despite the civil war, people gathered at Al-Muhdar Mosque in Tarim on Monday. American government officials are working with Haitian authorities to free 12 adults and 5 children kidnapped last Saturday by a gang known for murders, kidnappings, and extortion in Haiti. The 17 are part of a U.S.-based missionary group. While religious organizations are often seen as assets, they can also find themselves in peril. They serve as frontline partners when the United States government needs a presence in the world's most dangerous places. Melanie McAllister, a professor of American Studies at George Washington University, said NGOs are better at setting up clinics in places like South Sudan or Haiti. The Muslim world is especially sensitive about groups attempting to convert people. In one high-profile case from 2007, 23 Christian missionaries from South Korea were abducted by the Taliban in Afghanistan. They were freed only after Seoul agreed to withdraw troops from the U.S.-led mission in the country. A Muslim lawyer from New Jersey is suing the State Bar Association for discrimination. That is for a policy aimed at fostering diversity on its board of trustees. Rajesh Saadeh, who heads a 6-person law firm in Bridgewater, says the association reserves 8 of its 49 trustee seats for members of certain underrepresented groups. Saadeh says that practice is discriminatory because he is not a member of any of them. A former association trustee, Saadeh is also critical of the group's decision to not add Muslims to the list of those underrepresented on its board. Zalmay Khalilzad, U.S. Special Envoy for Afghanistan, is stepping down from his post. According to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Khalilzad's former deputy, Thomas West, will assume the role. Khalilzad served as the top U.S. envoy for Afghanistan under the Trump and Biden administrations. He was the architect behind the bilateral deal former President Donald Trump struck with the Taliban that led to U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. Khalilzad was the highest-ranking Muslim serving the administration. Senior Pentagon officials blamed the collapse of the Afghan government to the 2020 U.S. deal with the Taliban, which promised a complete U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. A coalition of more than 24 press freedom groups on Monday demanded the U.S. Department of Justice drop its charges against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. The coalition renewed its call due to recent reports that the CIA plotted to kidnap and possibly kill the journalist. In a letter sent Friday to Attorney General Merrick Garland, several of the groups said Assange's prosecution is a threat to press freedom around the globe. Among the letter's signatories were the Knight First Amendment Institute, Committee to Protect Journalists, Freedom of the Press Foundation, and Reporters Without Borders. Assange is imprisoned in London's maximum security Belmarsh prison. Common Dreams reported last month under former President Donald Trump, the CIA discussed kidnapping or assassinating Assange. China is banning Quran apps. Here's a report by Saleha Farouk and Assad Khan.
Communist China does not believe in God, but now it is going around enforcing others not to believe in God either. First, China went after Uyghur Muslims. They raided their homes, took 1 million of them to the largest concentration camps since the Nazis, and they snatched away the Quran of those still at home. But now Apple has joined them. The app in question is called Quran Majid. It is made by a Pakistani company called Pak Data. It is used by millions around the world. It is so popular that in the App Store it has nearly 150,000 reviews. Another app is called the Quran Hive. There are hundreds of apps on the iPhone and Android which help you read the Quran on your smartphone. China, as usual, has given no reason as to why they have imposed this ban. But China itself also uses the Quran whenever it needs to. For example, a Turkish delegation recently was delighted to find copies of the Quran in each of their hotel rooms. So, for diplomacy, China can use the Quran, but not for its Muslims to read it.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes, Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse, walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
I am what hunger looks like in America. I am an 8-year-old girl who's not excited for the last day of school. Because this may be the last time I'll have lunch. Till September. I am a single father of 2 who works 3 part-time jobs, and that's still not enough to put food on the table. I was created by artificial intelligence from faces of the 1 in 8 Americans who struggle with hunger.
Feeding America, 200 food banks strong.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. In Muslim news, we covered the news of the 60th anniversary of the Paris massacre. To discuss this in detail, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. France done the strangest stuff sometime. One thing which I never heard of is that about 60 years ago, 12,000 French police in Paris attacked, tortured, and threw people in a river, about 30,000 peaceful Algerians who were protesting there. It was something which I didn't know, and when I wrote about it on my social media, people said, "What are you talking about? Never heard of it." We have a professor from UCLA who is keeping an eye on these things, Professor Leah Brosgell. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you very much for having me.
Tell us what happened 60 years ago on October 17, 1961, and why it remains hidden.
This is a fair question, and thank you for asking it. Already in your introductory comments, you've hit on a couple of really important key aspects of this event. One of those being the fact that it has been hidden from view, so to speak, for such a long time, not only internationally, but also in France and also to a certain degree in Algeria. So the event that you are referencing is a massacre that took place on October 17th, 1961 in Paris. And I should say this event took place in the center of Paris, not in some sort of peripheral peri-urban zone, but right in the center of that city that so many of us know so well, that so many of us associate with France's reputation as being a haven for the rights of man and for human rights in general. So there's something symbolically important also about recognizing that this quote-unquote hidden massacre took place in plain view in the capital of France. The context is really important here. So in October of 1961, one needs to remember that France and Algeria are at war with one another. This is perhaps a more complicated concept than it might be normally because Algeria at the time was considered not just a colonial possession of France's, but Algeria was considered part and parcel of France. In other words, it was considered a kind of extension of the nation, even though it was separated from the mainland by the Mediterranean Sea. So in 1961, these countries have in their rearview mirror 130 years of a colonial relationship that was necessarily a violent one. And in 1954, Algeria began a war for independence from France to break the hold of the colonial yoke. And this war would last from 1954 to 1962. An interesting feature of this war, many of your viewers will have seen, for example, the Battle of Algiers, which does a very good job of representing the kind of guerrilla violence and urban warfare that was kind of the hallmark of the war in Algeria. But in 1958, the FLN, or the National Liberation Front, the Algerian Freedom Fighters movement, and the government party in power today, the FLN would open what they called a second front in mainland France, meaning the decision was taken to bring the war home to the metropolitan region, to make the case for Algerian independence known and felt, not just by the French government, but also by rank-and-file French citizens in the mainland. So during this time, post-1958, and until the Evian Accords, which would be signed in early 1962, there was quite a bit of urban violence taking place, mainly in Paris, but occasionally in other cities of France. And so in October of 1961, the chief of police, whose name at the time was Maurice Papon, decided to impose a curfew on the large population of Algerians who were living in and around Paris. And on October 17th, the FLN in France called for a peaceful demonstration against this protest. And so this is what leads us to the violence on the night of October 17th. Some 20,000 Algerian men, women, and children turned out at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night to protest the human rights violation that was indeed this curfew imposed on their community. It was, one can't say it enough, it was indeed a peaceful protest. It was well controlled and organized by the FLN leaders, and it was met by a brutal and bloody repression on the part of the Parisian police forces. Just to give you a sense of the scale of the violence, some 10,000 Algerian men were arrested and detained for indefinite periods of time in detention centers in and around Paris. It's difficult to establish with any certainty the actual number of dead that evening. What we know for certain is that there were no deaths on the side of the police forces. The official death count issued by the French government was 3 to 4 Algerians, but we know better that the number of victims ranges somewhere between 80 and 500, with most historians generally lighting on the figure of 200 as a sort of reasonable estimate of the number of deaths that occurred that night at the hands of the French police. So a massacre of some significant scale, and indeed often known as the bloodiest colonial massacre to take place on mainland soil, and perhaps the bloodiest and most murderous episode of state repression to have taken place in most of the 20th century.
The police chief, which remained a police chief after all of these things which he did, was tried because of his Nazi connection and things like that. Why he was never tried on what he did on October 17th, the massacre of Paris.
That's right. As you state very correctly, Maurice Papon was never tried for his role in the October 17th massacre of Algerians in Paris. Indeed, he was given free rein by the government to quote unquote hold the capital as best he could. While he was not in the streets perpetrating violence himself, he certainly allowed his men to act with impunity and encouraged his men to behave in a way that was not only unfettered, but he also guaranteed them that they would not face consequences for their action. So he was very much sort of we might call him kind of the mastermind or the instigator of this violence. And indeed, he would never be brought to justice or even to trial for this. But again, as you rightly point out, he was brought to trial. And indeed, Maurice Papon spent basically beginning in the early 80s, he spent the last decades of his life in and out of the courtroom for other misdeeds of his. And these are namely his role in the deportation of French Jews from the Bordeaux region of France during World War II under the Vichy regime. And so it is thought that Papon, in his role as a government functionary in Bordeaux, or in the Gironde region, was responsible for sending thousands of French Jews to the sort of holding camp north of Paris called Drancy, from where they were sent onward to the east, often to Auschwitz and other death camps. And so, as I mentioned, beginning in 1981 in the French press, Papon's role in the deportation of French Jews began to be explored in the press. And he would spend, indeed, a good 2 decades trying to defend himself against these charges. He would eventually be found guilty of crimes against humanity for his role in the deportation of French Jews in 1998. He would eventually be stripped of his medals, etc., and otherwise taken to task. The question, why was he tried for those crimes and not for the October 17th crimes, is a very complicated one. On the one hand, it has to do with the degree to which the October 17th massacre was effectively covered up for many decades by the French government. The press was censored. The various actors were obviously, the culpable actors were obviously very unwilling to talk about what they had done and why, to address the true nature of their crimes. Families of victims were also very hesitant to come forward and ask for justice. They feared reprisals. Even the Algerian government was at the time more focused on getting to independence than it was on litigating this particular episode of violence. And so it would take, and it still is taking, a lot of time for this, for the full story of October 17th to be told, both in France and in Algeria. We might also think about the fact that, of course, in the aftermath of World War II and beginning notably in the early 60s, the trials for Nazi war criminals were becoming more mediatized, more commonplace. And a couple of French lawyers, Serge Klarsfeld, his wife, and also his son, would sort of make it their cause célèbre to try to bring Papon to justice and to represent the families of the French who were deported. And so there was a lot of international and national pressure post-World War II to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. And the Klarsfeld family was able to sort of take advantage of that wave in their work to bring Papon to justice. There has been, and I would say there is, far less of a politically important lobby when it comes to defending the rights of Algerians, to finding justice and compensation for the victims and their families, the victims of October 17th and other victims of colonial violence. That remains a more polemic issue.
It seems it sort of reflects their powerlessness in the society also, because they were in ghettos, nobody cared, and so somehow Algerian lives at that moment were not considered as important in the eyes of the activists. But then how come the story survived, that a person who has no connection with either of the side now comes to know there was a massacre took place. So how that story survived?
Well, I like to think that it survived in part thanks to the incredible work of culture. I myself am not an historian, but a professor of literature, cinema, and culture, with a focus on France and its relationship with Algeria and North Africa more generally. And what's really interesting to me is to note the ways in which, despite and notwithstanding the government's attempts to black out this story, we find cultural productions documenting, if you will, testifying to and making known this very horrible story. So already in 1962, a documentary film was made, a documentary film called October in Paris by a French director named Jacques Panigel, who was very much interested, who had witnessed the events himself and was very much interested in trying to provide a kind of lasting document of what he saw as an incredible state injustice against peaceful Algerian protesters. There was also a poem written by an Algerian poet named Kateb Yassine that was published in 1962 called In the Jaws of the Wolf. And in its very short poem, Kateb Yassine describes very succinctly Algerian protesters being thrown into the river while people stood by and did nothing. And then perhaps even more remarkably, in 1963, an American novel was published. This novel's title is The Stone Face. And this novel was written by a Black American writer who himself also was living in France at the time of the events of 1961, and who witnessed the demonstration and its repression by the police, and who even tried to get involved with defending an Algerian woman from the police violence. And this writer, William Gardner Smith, lightly fictionalized this story in The Stone Face, which is in fact the first novel to represent this particular historical event. Interestingly, that novel would go out of print by the end of the 1960s and has only just been reissued by the New York Review of Books. I can only recommend it most heartily to your viewers, with an excellent preface by the writer Adam Schatz, which really gives an interesting sense of the racial politics and the colonial politics at play in Paris in the late days of the war and in 1961. And then, if you will, I would say that the younger generation has also worked hard to try to represent this event. Many young Algerians who came of age in France because their families immigrated to France during the war would become writers who would also, in their first novels, feature this event as a kind of foundational event for their identity as French citizens of Algerian descent, attempting to come to terms with a complex history and a complex identitarian position in France.
Professor Brasgale, tell us a little bit about the, where the French government stands at this moment. Do we have all the facts out? Are all the documents of that era available for scholars? What is government doing about it?
The question of the police archives has been a thorny question for a long time. And again, beginning around the mid-'80s, activist groups which had formed around the same time began making claims and requests that the police archives relative to this event be open. France has a very complicated system of archival legislation. The archival politics in France date back to the times of the monarchy. Of course, they've been refreshed since then. The the rules that govern when archives can be declassified are somewhat cumbersome, even for experienced scholars to navigate. And so for a time, any archives related to the Algerian War of Independence and the history of colonization were subject to a 50-year moratorium during which they could not be consulted. So this obviously makes getting to the heart of the matter and getting to the truth very difficult. I will say that in 2012, the police archives related to this event, to the October 17th massacre, were indeed declassified. I was able to consult them myself on two different occasions in the summer of 2012 and in 2013. I should actually say they were officially declassified on the anniversary in 2011, and people started consulting them with some more frequency beginning in 2012. But questions remain as to whether these archives have been expurgated, whether they contain all of the facts and all of the materials. The archives themselves are somewhat chaotic to deal with. They're not cataloged necessarily in a way that would allow you to go back and re-find traces of work that are referenced by historians. But nonetheless, quite a good history was written already in 2005 by a couple of British scholars named James House and Neil McMaster, and this is called Paris 1961, Algerians, Memory and State Terror. And this particular book, in fact, was written using a special dispensation obtained by the authors to be able to consult the police archives. And to my knowledge today, it's the most complete archival, it's the most complete work of historiography that is based on archives and represents one of the most careful combings through of the archive that we see in any work of history. But it remains a point of contention amongst activists and amongst politicians, and even on the part of the families of victims, this sort of sense that we can't really know for sure whether all of the elements are there. I will say also, having consulted the archives, as I mentioned twice, that there is no sort of smoking gun in these archives. And I think for in the decades of the 80s and the 90s, a lot of the claims on the part of the of activist associations were clinging to the belief that there was some kind of inculpatory evidence available in those archives that we just couldn't get at. Again, if there ever had been, I'm not sure there still is. So there's no sort of documents that tell us exactly the number of the dead. There's no documents that explain why the police suddenly allowed themselves to behave in this violent and unfettered manner, despite the fact that the crowd itself was fully peaceful. So there's something, on the one hand, it's very satisfying to be able to comb through these archives. It says a lot about the degree to which the event was seen at the time, witnessed and known. And so it sort of, it lays bare this falsehood that nobody knew about October 17th at the time. It was very possible to have known about the event at the time. But what it doesn't give us satisfaction about is sort of the exact nature of guilt and the exact nature of the numbers of dead and the sort of, unfortunately, the methods of killing, which also remain sort of in the shadows.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Roscoe, for your time. I appreciate that.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.